Welcome back. This is my podcast. We're going through the Bible book by book, kind of. We did Genesis and Exodus, and then we jumped into Acts to kind of tie that New Testament. Acts is kind of the bridge between the Old Testament and New Testament and shows you really who Paul is, who Peter is, and a lot of what Jesus did after the resurrection. So we're in chapter 27. If this is your first video, go back and listen to the other ones because it'll make a whole lot more sense that way. So let's jump right into Acts chapter 27. And I'm going to read from the New Living Translation, not because it's better, but because it's a little easier to read. But there's really more depth in the complete Jewish Bible, but some of the words make it hard to read. So I'm not going to bore you with that part. So let's go. When the time came, we set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. We left on a ship whose home port was Adramyttium and the northwest coast of the province of Asia. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. The next day, when we docked at Sidon, Julius was very kind to Paul and let him go ashore to visit with friends so they could provide for his need. Remember, he's a prisoner, and he let him go and come back on his own. Putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So we sailed north to Cyprus between the island and the mainland. Keeping to the open sea, we passed along the coast of Sicilia and Pamphylia, landing at Myra in the province of Lycia, where the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship from Alexandria that was bound for Italy, and he put us on board. We had several days of slow sailing, and after great difficulty, we finally neared Cnidus. But the wind was against us, so we sailed across to Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island, past the Cape of Solomon. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived. Sorry, I didn't silence my phone again. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fair Havens, near the town of Lycia. We had lost a lot of time. The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall, and Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. Men, he said, I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well. But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. And since Fair Havens was an exposed harbor, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, farther up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a southwest and northwest exposure. When a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought they could make it, so they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength burst across the island and blew us out to sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. We sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Caudia, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard the lifeboat being towed behind us, when the sailors bound ropes around the hull of the ship to strengthen it. They were afraid of being driven across the sandbars of Syrtis off the African coast, so they lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. So basically, they're going along the rocky shore, and they don't want to go into the shore and crash. The next day, as gale force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars until at last all hope was gone. No one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all this damage and loss, but take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night, an angel of the God of whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me, and he said, Don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said. But we will be shipwrecked on an island. About midnight on the 14th night of the storm, As we were being driven across the Sea of Adria, the sailors sensed land was near. They dropped a weighted line and found that the water was 120 feet deep. But a little later, they measured it again and found it was only 90 feet deep. At this rate, we were afraid we would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore, so they threw out all 4 anchors on the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put anchors from the front of the ship, but Paul said to the commanding officer and to the soldiers, "You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes on the lifeboats and let it drift away. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. "You have been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks," he said. "Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair on your head will perish." Then he took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all, and broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat. All 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. When the morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. So they cut off the anchors and left them in the sea. Then they lowered the rudders, raised the foresail, and headed towards the shore. But they hit a shoal and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship stuck fast, while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the force of the waves and began to break apart. The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land. The others held on to planks or debris from the broken ship, so everyone escaped safely to shore. I know it's kind of a long chapter, and it's like, why are we getting all these details? Well, it's Paul. I mean, it's Luke, and he is a detailed kind of guy. That's just who he is. He likes to give specifics on things, but it's also important that we see some of these specifics because Saul was given over to Julius. That was a big deal to be trusted with the prisoner, but it was also a really big deal that he wasn't in chains. He had built some kind of bond with him, and that's really important. When we're talking about our faith and we're talking about the Bible, I don't think we should sugarcoat it and make it sound all, rose-colored, but we also have to build a relationship in order to talk about the hard stuff. Because if you're too afraid to talk about the hard stuff, you're never going to really learn who God is and what God expects from us. So we got to know those kind of things. So probably this was the Aristarchus in Colossians 4 and Philemon 1, who is the fellow prisoner with Saul. So Luke says that the ship had 276 people aboard. It would have been crowded and uncomfortable. That's a lot of people on a cargo ship that was probably not that big back then. So the fast was an expression that is in the complete Jewish Bible, but it's not really mentioned in the New Living Translation. And so we kind of missed that he was calling for, that they needed to be there in time for the fast. That meant Yom Kippur. That's just what they called it. It was the Day of Atonement when all Jews fasted. So Yom Kippur was at the first week, at the end of the first week of October. So that's how we know what time of year this stuff was happening, that and based on the storms and stuff. So the centurion Julius, he opted to sail on to Phoenix. There would have had to been a change in the wind for this to work. So they had to wait a little while to see what would happen. This was not all happening in a day. This was days, weeks. So the grain below, also, the reason they threw that out is because once it gets wet, it expands, and it was busting the ship apart. It was pushing against the ship. And, 2 weeks of the ship just rolling, would have been murder for their appetites, their mental health too. But the more this kind of moved, the more it expanded and almost broke the ship apart. So Saul told everyone that they were suffering from a lack of food. And verse 23 explains that a messenger of God told him to not be afraid. He didn't say he just dreamed it. This was a messenger came to him. And Saul uses language that Gentiles relate to. He can't be too Jewish, or he's not going to be understood by these common people, especially, the prisoners are mostly Gentiles, so they wouldn't have understood some of the things he was saying. And the soldiers were Roman, so Saul wanted to be clear that the storm god, the god of the sea, the god of the wind, and any other god that they thought about could not overcome the will of the God of Israel. And so what that tells us is that they were probably praying out to their various gods. And what he was trying to say is all these gods that y'all have made up will not be able to stop the will of God. And he was showing them in real time with an actual demonstration the God of the universe is the only true God. But God says, just trust me. And the God of Israel had already determined that everybody on that ship was going to be saved. They were going to go through trauma. That was going to continue. But he basically says, trust me. In the end, it's going to be okay. Whatever we're going through, God's saying, I got it. You either trust me or you don't. And real faith means, hey, despite what I see, I trust the God of the universe, Yeshua. So many New Testament commentators insist that this is Saul performing communion, but it wasn't at all. Every Jewish meal began with something called a barakah, and it's a blessing. And the procedure is the host just breaks the bread and passes it. That, they say a prayer and then bless it and pass it around. And it was just normal for Jews to do. And there's so much research out there now that when somebody's going through trauma, that spiritual aspect of it, that normalcy, that something that's bigger than you helps bring you back to where God really wants you to be. And that peace, that shalom, because it's familiar. That's what our body, our mind searches for. And it was very normal for a Jew. I mean, it was every meal a Jew ate, this happened. And it had nothing to do with the Constantinian church creation of communion. That was something completely different. So most of the passengers were probably Jews. And if Saul hadn't done this, this would have been offensive to them because some of them were coming because of who he was. But the prisoners and the Roman soldiers could really relate to it. They'd probably seen it at different times watching Jewish people eat. And so it helped him kind of solidify that. So why would he risk his life for other prisoners? It is the mystery of God, the mercy of God. I mean, we don't know. It's just the will of God. And I think what Paul's trying to show us is how far are we willing to go before the circumstances make us turn back. And being uncomfortable is a really great way to be in God's will. If you are really comfortable, safe, and secure, and nothing's going wrong in your life, you're probably not walking and living and learning about God on a regular basis. It's just my theory. But hopefully you come back. We'll wrap up chapter 28 and the book of Acts, and then we are going to go into Leviticus because I just have to teach it. I can't get past it. You're going to love it way more than you could have ever imagined before. God bless. Love God, love people, and change the world.